This is part 2 of my presentation on reading. The first part was on why it's important to read. Part 2 is about making time for reading. I think most people say, at least, that reading is important to them, but we all struggle to make time for reading, and everybody's so busy and life moves quickly. So I thought I'd offer a few suggestions of things that have worked for me around how to make time for reading. And the first part connects to part 1 of my presentation, which is develop a clear and compelling why story. And by why story, I just mean why it's important to read. Because essentially we do what we value most. Some of you may be familiar with Jim Trelease's book, The Read Aloud Handbook. And I just want to read a passage from that speaks to this a little bit. He says, people carry on these days as though the universal clock has somehow shrunk from 24 hours to 18. Granted, there are a few people whose work schedules are truly beyond the norm, but they are few and far between. If there were a national time shortage, the malls would be empty, Netflix would be defunct, and the cable TV companies would be bankrupt. Ultimately, what it boils down to is Sister Patricia Joseph's cautionary words to me when I was 16. I was the designated class artist, and she asked me to draw something for her bulletin board over the weekend. I showed up empty-handed on Monday with the excuse that I hadn't had enough time. With a steely look, she said quietly, "That's all right, James, but please understand, even the busiest people find the time for the things they truly value." Her thought was on target that day, and it still is. If you truly value reading, you will find the time. Like Sister said, it's all about the value system. And Calgary Reads is certainly about valuing reading. And I think it's one of those things that we say we value. But sometimes I do this thing with myself where I test my values by imagining that a group of aliens is observing me for a couple of weeks to be able to figure out, based on what I do, what I actually value. And I think, would they figure out that I value reading? And it's a good exercise to do with yourself. If we truly value reading, we will make time for it. So if you're not able to make time for it, it may be that you need to explore that a little bit more. Do you truly value reading? And develop a really clear and compelling why story so that when other things are pushing to take priority, that you have a way of fighting that, a way of making reading a priority. The second idea I have about how to make more time for reading is to challenge your assumptions about your own limitations. We tell ourselves all kinds of stories about ourselves, many of which are not true, actually, and lots of them are associated with our own limitations. You probably know the story of Roger Bannister, who was the first to break the record for, he was the first one to run a 4-minute mile. Which is interesting in itself, but what I find even more interesting is that after he broke that record, a whole bunch of other people did. You have to ask yourself, what's going on there? Why would that be the case? Did they suddenly develop the physical capacity to be able to run a 4-minute mile, around the same time? And I think what's more likely is that what he broke was the mental barrier, that they had assumed it wasn't possible, and so they didn't do it. And once they realized that this is actually something that can be done, they were able to, those in good physical shape were able to run a 4-minute mile. So we can do the same thing with reading. We can tell ourselves that our lives are too busy to be able to make time for reading. But we have to understand that there are Roger Bannisters in our midst. There are people who are just as busy as we are, and they read. And certainly there are times when life overtakes us and we're not going to be able to, read as much as we want to all the time. But when that's a chronic excuse, then it requires some scrutiny, some looking at that point. We can also limit ourselves by telling ourselves that we're not readers, which is a bit like saying we're not a runner. Readers are just people who read, and runners are people who run. We could become runners, assuming we're able-bodied. And there are apps for that. There's an app for taking you from couch potato to 5K in, I don't know, a couple of months. Reading is the same. We can become readers. So we need to challenge those types of limitations, those stories that we tell ourselves in order to make more time for reading. A third suggestion is just start. So for years I had this quote on my blackboard: action precedes motivation. And it was one of the most helpful quotes I've ever come across, helpful in all kinds of realms. I mean, it would get me on the treadmill. I would not wait to be motivated to get on the treadmill. I would just start. I would say to myself, Elizabeth, just 5 minutes, just start. And once I'd done 5 minutes or 10 minutes, I found the motivation followed. And that happens more often than you think. I mean, motivation is important, but it's treacherous. It's not always there. It's not reliable. So if you wait to be motivated, chances are you'll never read. Just start, and the motivation will follow. Just trust that it will follow. The fourth suggestion is to rely on structure. Structure is our friend. So years ago, I was working on a book, and I write all the time for the work that I do. But I actually wanted to work on a book, and it was a terrifying prospect to me, even though I write all the time. And I was having trouble getting started, being motivated. And then I came across something about Raymond Chandler, who was a fiction writer many decades ago, and what he called his nothing alternative. So he found that it was counterproductive to tell himself he had to write. Instead, he said, I never tell myself that I have to write. What I say instead is, Raymond, you don't have to write, but for the next 4 hours, you can't do anything else. And he said it was amazing how when faced with that as an alternative, he wrote. And so I tried this. Very same thing. I blocked off 4 hours every morning where I was not allowed to look at my email, look at anything on any websites, have my phone nearby. So the alternative was nothing, and I discovered that is excruciating. So I would write just to alleviate the boredom. And it took the pressure off, actually, which was an added bonus. I wasn't, thinking I needed to be brilliant. I just was writing so that I wouldn't be bored. And then things emerge. I'm not suggesting that you need to create a do-nothing alternative to reading, although that might work for some of you. I'm just saying that was a way of using structure to accomplish something that was harder for me to accomplish. And there's all kinds of ways to build in structure to support reading. So book clubs are a way of building in structure. You have a book and you have to get the kind of book club where you actually discuss the books. So you feel guilty if you don't read it, but that's a form of structure. Or being accountable to a friend, saying, this month let's read this book. Building it into your schedule. That just like work, you have this half hour every day when you read that's just built into your schedule. That's a way of building structure. Or even, I know Calgary Reads talks about the idea of having a place in your home where there's a reading lamp, there's a bookshelf, there's a comfy chair, an inviting place where you want to go to read. That's a way of building in structure and taking advantage of structure as well. The fifth idea is to make it a habit. And this book, The Power of Habit, I think is really quite helpful in understanding how to harness the power of habits. So we sometimes think about bad habits that are hard to break, but we don't think about the fact that good habits can really serve us. And the reason is because a habit is just something that's been programmed in. You don't have to think about it anymore. It's not. It doesn't require a lot of conscious thought. When I get up in the morning, I don't deliberate and think about, should I brush my teeth today? Or, I just don't do that. I just brush my teeth every day. It just becomes a thing that I do. And we can do the same with reading. It takes a while, and this book talks about how you cultivate good habits. It takes a little while, but it doesn't take that long for something to become a habit. You just have to do it repeatedly for a period of time consistently, and then it just becomes second nature. So if you for example, chose a time of day every day when you will read for half an hour, let's say right after supper, you do the dishes and then you read for half an hour, and that's just what you do every day, or when you first get up in the morning, it would just become a habit and something that you build in to your everyday life. The last suggestion is to compile a to-don't list. We all are masters of the to-do list, and our to-do lists are huge usually. And that's a big part of why we can't make time for reading, because there is too much on our plate. So if we are to make time in a really full schedule, something's going to have to come off, likely. So what will come off? It might be Facebook time or Netflix binging or sleeping in on the weekends. But just sort of looking at your life and thinking about what can come off your plate at this point to make time for reading. So those are sort of the 6 suggestions I have. Develop a clear and compelling why story. Challenge your assumptions about your own limitations. Just start. Action precedes motivation. Rely on structure. Make it a habit, and compile a to-don't list.